Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the first lecture. We are the first lecture of behavior economics. So my name is Bao Tu. I'm currently an associate professor of economics at the School of Social Sciences of NTU. Yeah, so in this course, basically, we're going to cover the main topics in the interesting subject of behavior economics. So the first lecture will be just the general introduction of this course. So I'm just going to tell you some basic concepts in behavior economics, and then I'm also going to show you some nice examples of different topics in this subject. Okay. All right. So first, what is behavior economics? Well, in a broad sense, behavior economics is just a kind of a intersection of economics and psychology, or the interdisciplinary study of economics and psychology. So basically, I mean, in your previous courses, you have studied a lot about the standard economic theory or traditional economic theory. So traditional economic theory is usually based on what we call rational choice paradigm, where we assume that people are kind of rational. So in economics, we have a special definition for rationality. So basically, economics being economically rational means that you are basically selfish, you only care about your own material benefit, and then you are able to solve the optimization problem, solve the profit maximization problem or utility maximization problem to seek the maximum of your satisfaction. Okay? And basically, this is how people make decisions in a traditional economics model. So basically, they are given um, resources, they are also given budget constraints, and under these constraints, they try to make the best kind of a resource allocation decision so that they can maximize their utility or well-being. So this is what people usually do, decision makers usually do in standard economics models. But in psychology, on the other hand, psychology, you are usually more interested about people's psychological limitations, such like their limited ability in making perfect perception or cognition or paying attention and so on. And also in psychology, we also study how emotion influence decision making. And basically, there seems to be a little bit contradiction, right? A contradiction between the basic philosophy of economics and psychology. So in traditional economics models, we assume that people are able to make rational, perfect decisions. But in psychology, we pay more attention to how people may deviate, right, substantially from being perfectly rational. So but on the other hand, right, on the other hand, we all understand that in reality, people are more like psychological people, right? A lot more like the description by psychology instead of economics. So behavioral economics arises as the response, as a response to the critique on traditional economics models for being too unrealistic, right? So basically, the target or the mission of behavior economics is trying to supplement or complement economics models with psychological factors so that it can make a better description about how real people behave in real life. So, or in other words, in general, just one sentence, behavioral economics is trying to combine traditional economics with psychological biases such that we can make economics more realistic. Okay. All right. So, I mean, and also just to give you some flavor about what psychological bias look like. So in case you don't have a previous exposure to psychology, so here are some examples. I think many of them have the name called in general Ebbinghaus effect. So let's say, so for example, if we look at the graph on the top left, right, on the top left. So basically all the green lines here, they have the same length. But on the other hand, right, if you really look at them, at least what your eyes tell you will be something like a different story. So basically, if you just do an eyeball test, then you will get a feeling that the lines below, right, appear to be a little bit longer than the lines above, than the lines above. Okay, or so to say, if you look at the top right, even though all the black squares and the white squares, they are there, they keep still, but if you stare them for a while, you will get some illusion that they might be moving, right? Also the same case for bottom left. And finally, for button right, so this is a very kind of a seminal example of a framing effect, in the sense that, right, in the sense that if you look at the yellow circle, the yellow circle in the graph, uh, in general, the yellow circle on the left and on the right are more or less the same size. They are more or less equally big or equally small. But on the other hand, when it's surrounded, right, when it is surrounded by larger gray circles, right, on the left, it appears smaller. On the other hand, when it was surrounded by smaller gray circles, then they will appear to be bigger. So this is also kind of another good example, this Ebbinghaus effect, a good example of a framing effect. So basically, when people are making assessment in real life, their judgment is highly, highly context dependent. Their judgment is highly, highly context dependent. It's heavily influenced by the frame instead of being very, very consistent. Okay. All right. So basically, this is like economics and psychology uh, foundation for behavior economics. And actually, I think more recent studies can go a little bit even more advanced. So, for example, from a biological point of view or psychological point of view, if you want to understand the decision process or cognitive process of humans really well, you also want to rely on the technology from neuroscience. So basically nowadays more and more the subject of psychology depends on evidence from neuroscience. So basically it associates different emotions or different tendencies to different areas of the brain and trying to find the biological explanation based on the brain kind of the activity in brain functioning areas. Okay. And therefore, in the recent past, we also see the rise of neuroeconomics within economics. So neuroeconomics is more like a more specialized subfield of behavioral economics, with a particular emphasis on how we can try to explain uh, decision biases or cognitive biases, um, or cognitive limitations in economic decision making using neuroscience technology or evidence from neuroscience. Okay, so this is basically the rise of a new field of neuroeconomics. Okay. And in terms of key figures in behavioral economics, I can briefly mention a few. Actually, many of them have been awardees or recipients of the highly, highly prestigious Nobel Prize in Economics. So, for example, the first one, Daniel Kahneman, Professor Daniel Kahneman, I think he was a professor of economics and psychology from Princeton University. I think he was granted the Nobel Prize in economics in year 2002. Besides being really a prominent scientist, he is also a great writer for kind of a popular science reading. So, for example, he has this very nice book called Thinking Fast and Slow, uh, really like a very best-selling economics popular book in history. So, a very nice behavioral economics book was also written by him. So, this is Professor Daniel Kahneman. I think. Probably also the first or one of the first behavior economists who was awarded the Nobel Prize due to their contribution in behavior economics. And yeah, by his side is Amos Tversky. Amos Tversky is a close co-author of Daniel Kahneman. So basically, most of Kahneman's most important works have been jointly written with Tversky. So basically, Kahneman, we are going to see many of them in this course, Kahneman Tversky works. I think Tversky basically died pretty young. It's a great pity to economics, science, and many people also believe that if Tversky lived long enough, he will also be awarded the Nobel Prize jointly with Kahneman. I think Kahneman died a few years ago. A few years ago, he had a long, yeah. So basically, I think he died when he was like in his late 90s or even more late 80s or even more than 90 years old. Okay, and then on the right, we also have Richard Thaler. Richard Thaler, I think he was given the Nobel Prize pretty recently. He is a professor at the University of Chicago, Booth Business School. He has this very famous book called Nudge, like how to apply behavioral economics knowledge to design a kind of a small public policy to promote good behavior or more recommendable behavior. That's also one of the greatest popular reading in economics. I think that one was written with a law yeah, researcher in law, very famous law professor, Case Sunstein from Harvard University. And more recently, Thaler also has another book called Misbehaving. I think those are like Thinking Fast and Slow, Nudge, Misbehaving. They have all been the most important and actually also most interesting uh, popular readings for behavior economics. If you are interested, okay. And we can also talk about a bit more. These two are more like my personal favorite. So on the left is Professor Robert Shiller. Robert Shiller is a professor of finance in the, I think, in the Yale School of Management of Yale University. Um, so Shiller is more like he mainly study behavioral finance topics using empirical data. So later on, we're also going to talk about the research methodology for behavior economics. So the previous two, right, so three, they were more like studying behavior economics topics more related to people's daily life and the policy issues, public policy issues. But for Robert Shiller, he is more focused only with the financial market. So he has this very nice book called Rational Exuberance, talking about something like the financial bubble, especially the housing bubble, between the subprime crisis in the United States in year 2007. And yeah, that's a really nice reading, not only important as a reference in behavioral finance, but also quite important for important reference for people to understand the formation of the subprime crisis, the Great Recession. Okay, and then Robert Shiller also has another popular writing about behavior economics together with George Akerlof. George Akerlof is also a very great economist, behavior economist. George Akerlof actually was awarded the Nobel Prize, but for a different reason. I think George Akerlof was awarded Nobel Prize due to his contribution for microeconomic theory. But at the same time, George Akerlof is also a very, very important behavior economist. He wrote many important papers and research. So their book called An Animal Spirit is really a very nice book. You can get a lot of useful knowledge from it, and also it's very interesting. It's written also with a very interesting tone. And also besides another kind of interesting remark is that George Akerlof is a professor from UC Berkeley. He was Nobel Prize winner for microeconomics, and actually George Akerlof he's also the husband of Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen, if some of you know, Janet Yellen used to be, I think, the U.S. Minister of Treasury. Um, like a few years ago. So yeah, so quite interesting information. And then on the right, we also have this Dan Ariely. I think Dan Ariely is professor of psychology, more from psychology side, professor of psychology from Duke University. And I think his most interesting book is this book called Predictably Irrational. So this book is more psychology compared to behavior economics, but also quite interesting because they also talk about how you can use psychology for kind of a product design or marketing strategy making in business schools. So this is more like a business psychology, especially if you want to know more about how to apply behavior economics to business in the future. As you can see a little bit, right? So actually, Professor Ariely, if you look at his face, it seems that he has some wound. Uh, and actually, he was also always very open about it. And he was even using his wound in the face as an example in his book. He said that, yeah, it's just like I think he used to have a sadly, a very bad car accident when he was very young. So that hurt his face. And he also he mentioned that whenever he want to like I don't know do some treatment on the wound, he also try to study on himself. Like so first thing is that maybe if he want to change I don't know change the bondage of the wound, he can do that in a fast way or can do that in a slow way. So it's just it's basically a trade-off between a long and a milder pain and a short and sharp pain. And in the end, he said, well, I just go for I think the short and sharp pain. It's quite similar to the prediction of the prospect theory model as we're going to study later on in this course. And also he said that if you want to sustain, right, if you want to survive that part of life where you feel a lot of pain, it's also important you find some support for yourself. So for example, he watched a lot of movies when after the time following this accident. So he said that the movies. So basically, after each time after the treatment, when he feel the pain, and then he watched the movies, that helped him a lot to stabilize his mood and continue. Okay. All right, and yeah, so basically, as we mentioned, right, so we already know that behavior economics studies how psychological limitations affect economic decision making, right? Standard economics uh, or traditional economics models usually always assume that individuals have stable and coherent preferences and utility function that leads to rational choice. Behavior economics, on the other hand, try to provide more realistic foundations to explain why many times people may make seemingly irrational choices. And yeah, so here we also yeah show that many of these deviations or seemingly mistakes or irrationality can be explained by psychological theory or psychological factors. Yeah, so three topics to be discussed in this course. So first one is more like a bounded rationality. So how people deviate from being purely or perfectly rational. So how people may have cognitive limitations, inability to process complex information, or maybe they sometimes rely on simple heuristics and so on. Okay. And second one is bounded self-control. So usually, especially when we study intertemporal decision, we're going to see a lot of examples where people may make time inconsistent decisions. They may have, so for example, they may have difficulty of having self-control, and many of the times, people like you and me, we may have procrastination, right? Or unable to commit and so on and so forth. And then third broad topic is bounded self-interest. So basically, we also show that many times people may not be purely selfish, as rational economics models will predict. Many times, people do not only care about their own monetary benefit, they may also care about social comparison, they may also care about others, they may also have social comparison, and so on and so forth. Okay. And also in terms of the research methodology for behavior economics, we will say that behavior economics can use a mixture of many methodologies. So for example, we can have a theory, just as traditional economics. We have mathematical theory. We can solve the problem where people maximize the utility function subject to constraints. But of course, in behavior economics, besides monetary constraints or budgetary constraints, we may also have other constraints, such as limited ability for calculation or limited ability to make commitment, and so on and so forth. And second one is empirics. Okay, so it is indeed possible for us to investigate and verify or test the prediction of a behavioral economic theory using empirical archive data, just like many works by Professor Robert Shiller, right? You can show uh, investors in the financial markets or traders in financial markets, they are not perfectly rational by analyzing just like the US stock price data and so on. Okay. And third, very often, right, this is also something a little bit quite special for behavioral economics, is that behavioral economics usually rely a lot on data from experiments. So the experiments can be either laboratory experiments or field experiments, right? And so on and so forth. Some of you may also have experience participating in some of the lab experiments we run at the School of Social Sciences. If you have not, I mean, I can also invite you to do some, right? And you can also, right, it's also a nice opportunity for you to earn some money from it. Okay. And yeah, and also talking about experiments, also, I think, yeah, so when people talk about behavioral and experimental economics, many times we can talk about experimental economics together. So occasionally people may have the confusion between the two kind of subfields or two kinds of topics. And in particular, I'm not sure. So maybe in your curriculum, you can also see that you have this behavioral economics course taught by Prof. Echo and me. You can also have another course called Specialized Experimental Economics course. taught by Professor He Taisen at the same time. So what are the kind of relation and differences between the two subjects? So I will just tell you something like from my own take, my own understanding. So first thing is that behavioral experimental economics are indeed very, very closely related. Okay, very closely related. But secondly, as we mentioned before, behavioral economics do not necessarily always do experiments because we do have many behavioral economics papers, behavioral economic studies that use theory or pure unincentivized survey or empirical archive data instead of experimental data. Okay. And the third thing is also like experimental economics do not necessarily always have behavioral factors or psychological factors. So especially if you study some papers from experimental economics, some experimental economics papers only test traditional economics models, not behavioral economics models. So it's quite sufficient for you to do an experimental economic study that tests traditional theory only without touching on any behavioral or psychological factors. So that's also kind of a difference. Okay. And yeah, so then for the first lecture, we're just going to touch a little bit. So as you can see from the syllabus, right? As you can see from the syllabus, we have several topics. We have framing effect, we have time preference, uh, risk and preference for risk uncertainty, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so basically, in the first lecture, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the course, and also as well as each different topics, each different topics. Okay, so basically, yes. Um, let's say, so for choice and framing, so traditional economics usually assume that people just focusing on maximizing the total overall wealth, and it doesn't matter where the money come from and where the money goes, and so on and so forth. But from behavioral economics point of view, actually, many times we see in real life, people tend to segregate the change in their wealth into gains and losses, and when they're making decisions in general, their brains are going to process gains and losses very differently. Their brains are going to process gains and losses very, very differently. So for example here, okay, so as we can see, right, so for example, this is as we mentioned, right, a very famous study by Kahneman Tversky. So in their 1984 paper, it's already a very old study, but still very seminal. They asked just like this is just like in the class, they ask their students, I think about 100 American bachelor students. They asked them, so imagine that the US is preparing the outbreak of an unusual disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimate of the consequence of the program are as follows. Okay, so then just like asking the participants or the students, so which program or which treatment method do you want to use? Okay, let's say in the first question they ask, so there are two programs, program A and B. Program A, if program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, then there's a 1/3 of the chance all 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. Okay. Uh, yeah, before you look at the result, even though I already show you the result, right, you can guess what, right, what you will choose in this case, what you will choose in this case. So basically, probably many of you may choose A, right? Many of you may choose A. So basically, you can say that program A will treat 200 people. And on expectation, right? On expectation, program B is also going to treat 600 times 1/3 equal to 200 people. But on the other hand, you just get a feeling that it seems that A give you 200 people for sure, but B is going to give you like on expectation 200 people, sometimes more, sometimes less, appear to be a little bit more risky, right? A little bit riskier. So, and that's also actually the result of their study. And they show that among the 100 students, they ask their opinions. They find that 72 students chose A, and only 28% or 28 students choose program B. So it seems that people indeed for the same expected number 200 people to be saved, they prefer uh they will prefer the kind of the 200 people for sure, they would prefer the sure option instead of the risky option. Okay. But then they present another case, right? They present another case, and now maybe, yeah, you can see whether you will choose differently in this situation. So the other case is that imagine US is preparing for the outbreak of unusual disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. So background information the same. But now the estimation will be the following. So now the estimate is that there are still two programs, A and B. If program A is chosen, that's going to so 400 people will die. And if program B is chosen, then only a third probability nobody will die, and 2/3 probability all 600 people will die. Okay, so in this case, which one would you choose? Okay, which one would you choose? Maybe you can think a little bit. You can think a little bit on it. And if you think about it, now the answer seems to just go to almost the opposite, almost the opposite. So now you will see that uh, first one is like for sure 400 people will die. Second one is more like 2/3 probability 600 people die. So still on expectation 400 people die. But in this situation, it seems that you will feel like, okay, so the first one is like for sure a lot of people will die. Second one is there's a big chance, that's still big chance, everyone will die, but small chance nobody will die or everyone is going to be saved, right? But in this case, I mean, maybe you will think this way, and also you see most students in their study will think this way. So people might prefer to choose B over A in the sense that, or thinking that, right? Thinking that, um, so, well, since already 400 people will die for sure, why don't we gamble and see whether there is a chance to rescue more people, right? So in this case, more people are going to choose option B. But if you really think about it, right? If you really think about it, you will also see, actually, if you really read very carefully, if you compare the two questions, the program A in the first version is exactly the same as the A in the second version, right? And also the program B in the first version is also the same as the B in the second version. So there are 600 people. If you say you save 200 people, it must mean that 400 people will die, right? If you say that program B, there's a 1/3 probability nobody will die, so then it means that you save 600 people. And if you say a 2/3 probability 600 people will die, it just say that two-third probability, you save no one. The only difference is that, as we said, the first version presented to you, we're using we're using the framing of a gain, like how many people you save, right? How many people you save. How many like your gain is a gain compared to losing. And the second version is presented in terms of how many people will die. It's presented in terms of how many people will die. So it's more like a loss. It's more like a loss. Okay. So, yeah. And based on this one, Kahneman and Tversky, proposed that it seems that people may even have different risk attitude towards gains and losses. People appear to be risk averse, so they try to avoid any randomness as much as possible. People seem to be risk averse towards gains, and they seems to be risk seeking towards losses. Okay, they seems to be risk averse towards gains and risk seeking towards losses. Okay. And basically, then even another example, right? So basically, also about people's risk attitude towards gains and losses. So in an even earlier study, they ask people, how do you choose between the two options below, right? Um, so yeah. So in addition to whatever you own, you have been given 1,000. Now you're asked to choose between, right? Two options. First one is that with a 50% probability you get 1,000. And of course, a 50% you get zero, right? Or you get 500 for sure. So which one do you choose? You think about it, right? Second one is in addition to whatever you own, you have been given 2,000. You're asked to choose between, right? First one is losing 1,000 with a half, with a 50% probability. And second one is you're going to, right? You're going to lose 500 for sure. And in this case, right, in this case, probably if you think about it, you will feel like probably option C will be better than option D, right? So option D makes you already lose 500, but for option C, there is a chance that you lose a lot, but there is also a chance that you don't lose anything. So this is another example. This is another example of risk preference in the gain and loss domain. People appear to be risk seeking, risk averse in the gain domain, and they appear to be risk seeking in the loss domain. Okay. Yeah, so basically here's a summary. Standard economic theory says that choices have to be consistent, but people appear to be risk averse in gains and risk seeking in losses. And this might be explained by loss aversion in the sense that people probably will attach greater disutility of losing compared to the utility of gaining, right? So basically, people want to overturn losses, and that basically explain why people are risk-seeking in losses. They are more willing to gamble when they lose and try to overturn losses because they really hate losses. Okay, so basically this one, so this is this one, and yeah, there are also some more studies about loss aversion. So there is a one I like very much. It's conducted by Professor Simon Gatchter from I think University of Nottingham. And basically, they say that well, for many for many conferences, right? Nowadays, in order to encourage early registration, they will tend to have a lower registration fee for early registration and higher fee for late registration. But at the same time, if you talk about a low fee for early and a high fee for late, right? You can always say that in two different tones. One tone is we can say you can frame the lower lower early bird fee as a discount. So basically, you can say that okay, the low fee is called the discount rate, and the high fee is called the regular rate. Or alternatively, you can frame that as a kind of a punishment or penalty um, framing. You can say, okay, low fee is a regular fee and high fee is called the rate with penalty. Okay, so in this sense, right, in this sense, if people have a greater loss aversion, right, so probably they're more sensitive to the penalty treatment. They don't want to be penalized. They don't want to be punished. And probably um, calling the early bird rate the regular fee and the regular rate the penalty fee could potentially encourage people to do more early registration. Right, so basically, this is the thing. This happens in 1 year's ESA Economic Science Association conference, right? So basically, the conference participants will receive an email from the organizers. Uh, Most of the text will be the same, except that in the discount treatment, people are going to see, right? Going to see. Okay, so the regular fee is some amount, but you can have a discount, right? Discount fee if you do early bird registration. On the other hand, people in the penalty treatment will only see that, okay, so um, there is a regular fee for early registration, but if you register after July 10, you are going to have a penalty fee. Okay. And basically here they find something pretty interesting. So overall, there do not seems to be appear to be a difference. It seems that overall in the discount frame, in the discount frame, uh, the early registration fraction is 82%, and in the penalty treatment, the fraction of participants who do early registration is 86%, but the difference is not significant. But on the other hand, they appear to find that, um, while senior researcher does not seem to be influenced by discount or penalty very much, but for junior researchers, we'll see that in the discount frame, only 67% will register on time, but with a penalty frame, as high as 93% of them will register on time. Okay, so it seems that the loss aversion thing will apply more to junior researchers compared to senior researchers. You can say that, well, why junior researchers have a larger loss aversion? One thing could be that maybe their income is relatively lower, so they are more risk averse, or loss averse. Or you could say because they are relatively junior, they are more afraid of, right? They are more afraid of any judgment or negative feedback from the academic society or academic community. So they are more sensitive to that. Or I don't know. So you can basically the result can be explained both ways, right? So if you want to explain the high percentage of early registration in penalty treatment, you can say that's because they have greater loss aversion. But if you talk about they have a really low early registration rate in the discount frame, you can also say, well, maybe it's just because uh, the junior researchers they have less experience, so they have more difficulty arranging their traveling schedule. Um, in a very organized way compared to senior researchers. So there can be indeed many, many explanations. Okay. And then, yeah, so basically, before we take a break, maybe one more thing I want to quickly mention here is that, I mean, behavior economics is really, really a field where we open-mindedness, and also critical thinking. So because, I mean, as you can see from our previous right presentation, right? So behavioral economics arises because traditional economics is considered not so realistic. So it's like it responds to the critique on traditional economics. So also be exactly because of that, behavioral economics itself should be open to any criticisms or critical thinking. So, for example, right? So we have this very nice study about loss aversion. But can you think of something, right, other than framing effect that could potentially also explain the experimental result? Let's say for Kahneman-Tversky and maybe also for Gestalt study. Okay, so for example, I mean, at least for me, I will say, I think there can be something else. So for example, that can be even not like a cognitive factors, but more like a moral or emotional factors. So for example, in the the unusual disease case. So that basically very easily reminds me of a very famous story called trolley problem in ethics or in moral philosophy. I mean, I'm not sure if some of you have studied some philosophy before, right? So the trolley problem basically say that, well, there is a runway trolley running down the railway, right? Ahead, there are five people tied up, unable to move. Trolley is going to be headed straight towards them, and yeah, so you are standing next to a lever, right? If you pull the lever, the trolley, it seems that the trolley kind of lost control, so the driver cannot do anything to stop running over the five people and taking five lives. But you are near a lever. If you press the lever, the trolley can be switched to a different track, where there is only one person on the side track. So now you have two options. One is do nothing, and the trolley will just kill the five people and remain on the main track. Second is pull the lever, diverting the trolley into side track where they will only kill one people. What would you choose? What would you choose? I I guess I will believe that some of you will of course say that okay, one life like one life is less than five life, right? It's better to save five lives compared to one life. So, if I'm kind of a social planner, I want to maximize the social welfare. I should probably press the lever and reduce the casualty from five lives to one life. But at the same time, right? But at the same time, wouldn't you also think that there can be pretty good reasons for you not to press the lever? Okay. So for example, right? So for example, if you think that everyone's life are equal, you should press the lever. However, by doing this, you are killing one person with your own hands when you want to save five people. And then it appears that you would have the moral obligation of taking the one life. You will take the blame. You will take the blame. So, or so to say, it's something like if you do nothing, right? If you do nothing, the trolley will hit five people. It sounds like it's very bad, but it's not your responsibility. But if you do something actively, you save five lives, you take the praise, but then the one life will also that will also shift the blame for killing one person on you. Okay. So basically that could be something pretty subtle that's not exactly in the original version of Kahneman-Tversky, but could be potentially relevant in real life. Okay? So yeah. Yeah, so since we have already been running for 15 minutes, I think now is a good point for taking a break. So we're just going to take a break and continue uh, to more contents after the break. Okay, let's take a break here.